Hi, this is Paul. I'm going to keep going on this commentary from this conversation with Jordan and Jonathan and Douglas Murray. As I mentioned earlier, the I don't know that it was a great conversation in that you have a good dialogos between, let's see, the two parties. I think in a lot of ways there was a lot of sort of people hitting many of their points along the way, but actually connecting and finding each other didn't happen so much. Again, that's part of what any conversation around anyone with a significant fandom or fan base has, sort of triggers this dynamic that I think was spoken about well in a recent Brett Weinstein video.
I think generally, when you look closely at different disciplines, it looks like there are a few brilliant original minds that are coming up with original concepts, doing interesting work. And then there is another type of mind, which is the articulator, somebody that can skillfully talk about the concepts. Do a interview for PBS that becomes that gets the cultural designation of this here as an intellectual, and then problems are caused from that moment, because what happens is, like, there is a complex social phenomenon that happens where people will start to take sides. And now there are going to be, it seems to be within academia as well, there are going to be defenders of the personality and critics of the personality. And then very shortly, it is difficult to carefully reason through ideas because people start playing a social game.
Okay, right there. And whenever I do a critique of something like this, there are some people that Jordan Peterson, good, I must defend him. Anything he says, I will agree with. Jordan Peterson, bad, I must take away from his reputation. Anything that he says, I will disagree with. And same with Peugeot, same with Doug Murray, same with anyone. And it is a stupid, stupid game. It is a stupid, stupid game. Because they're going to say, and all of them will agree, they're going to say some things that are true and some things that have to be worked out. And so the whole point of having an adult conversation in a way like this is to say, I kind of agree with that, I kind of don't agree with that, is to just have a situation of nuance. The whole world can't be for or against any one individual. That, in a sense, in a weird way, whether you're for the individual or against the individual, either makes the individual God or Satan. And it's just a dumb way to play. So when I do a video like this, are you against Jordan Peterson because you critique that? Don't say anything negative about this conversation. It's sort of a natural way to go, but it's extremely low resolution. Conversations are as common as stones in Yosemite Park. They're all over the place, and some are better and some are worse, and some things come out from them and they serve some purposes, and that's the way it goes. So to have a conversation like this, to say, there's a ton of stuff I really liked about this conversation. What didn't work well was they didn't really connect. Some conversations, they might have huge synergy and connect really well, but maybe there won't be a lot of new points or insights that it provokes. This conversation had a lot of interesting ideas, but I don't think it really held together very well. That was sort of the point of the last video. Let's let Patterson finish his point here.
And now, I mean, the COVID stuff was the incredible example of this, right? How many people who took a very strong position on either the vaccine or ivermectin or whatever do you think were genuinely sitting down on either side and thinking through the concepts carefully? And how many were playing a social game? I think that's the same type of phenomenon that happens in academia as well.
And on YouTube, it becomes a social game, and social game is fine, but let's return then to the conversation.
That we're beings with value is something that has been so deeply built into our sense as a society that we don't even realize that this is what we're swimming in now. Obviously, that comes.
Okay, and there's this huge point that we are beings with value. That when we are see, even all of this has a degree of truth to it, but there's also its limitations. For example, the whole adage, tell the story about one person and you sort of have the world at your attention. Tell the story about 1 million people and it's kind of like washes right over.
From the Christian tradition.
It comes from the idea that we're created in the image of God.
Exactly. The image of God, and then the enlightenment.
Now, I often hear the Imago Dei, created in the image of God. That's a very complex. The reading of Genesis, the Imago Dei, the image of God in Genesis, I shouldn't say it in Latin, because I'm a Protestant, has a very interesting history. Because if you look over the history of interpretation, which is almost always a really interesting read, because if you read the Bible, say, oh, this is what this passage says. Okay, read the history of interpretation, all the different ways that the passage has been interpreted. I don't say that to sort of introduce relativism or pluralism, but just to recognize that different cultures read different passages in different ways. Is the image of God rationality? Is the image of God relationality? And on and on and on and on. And I just saw the usual Twitter fight about Christianity and slavery. Nowhere does the Bible endorses slavery in the Old and New Testament. Well, that's a rather unnuanced view. I think actually the take on slavery is quite a bit more complex than that, and in fact the definition of slavery is quite complex in and of itself. But what the point that Doug is about to make here is a critical one, because what happens in the Enlightenment is, in many ways, as Peterson has pointed out many times, sort of a rise in value of the individual in some ways, but not just of the individual. It's of the sort of a concern for the conscious suffering of an individual. One of the interesting themes when the Thunder Bay Conference recordings are released will be, so I talked to John Vervaeke about consciousness, and then he talked to Richard Mandrell about consciousness. And Mandrell's focus was, in similar to my respects, in to what degree can we publicly agree on affording consciousness to human beings, and then obviously in the conversation to spiritual bodies, to other things in the universe that don't necessarily aren't necessarily afforded consciousness, like the sun. Not that the sun has a lot to worry about from us, but so this conversation goes deep very quickly. And so even when we talk about value to individuals, the kind of value that we place to up the resolution on this is also important. For example, the justification for things like abortion, euthanasia, is often the relief of conscious suffering. What that means is that what is and isn't valued is whether or not an individual suffers. Now, this gets right into Jonathan Pageau's argument about the glass. Because when we look at a human being, well, what exactly in the human being do we value? Now, we might look at someone who is, let's say, valued for their physical beauty or their sexiness and say, well, that's objectification. You ought not to value them for their sexiness. Okay. Or if you look at someone, let's say, for their strength or brilliance in an industrial or academic, well, you shouldn't simply value them for their physical prowess on a football field or their mental brilliance in a lab, because then sort of you're using them. Where exactly the locus of value should be in a human being is itself not a simple thing. But yet we, as with Jonathan Pageau's glass, we look at it and we immediately sort of have assumptions about the good and grasp it. And one of the values that has sort of come in is, well, the value of an the aspect of value in an individual that we wish to prioritize is absence of suffering.
Enlightenment, the rationalist project, obviously to some extent extends or tries to embed and deepen aspects of that, including, of course, the idea of religious toleration. Because again, one of the reasons why Europe stopped believing was not just what I laid out as having happened in the 19th century, but the perhaps the worst realization of all, which was the repeated realization that peoples of faith could not exist together.
Okay, and someone pointed out in the comment section, I thought it was a really excellent comment about this point that Douglas Murray makes is vitally important. Let me replay a little bit of what he just said again.
Was not just what I laid out as having happened in the 19th century.
Okay, so part of the reason for, and we're going to have to press in terms of resolution of what we're talking about, for the loss of belief. Well, what do we mean by that? Especially when we look at, let's say, the Tom Holland thesis, and to a certain degree Douglas Murray's thesis that, well, Christianity remains pervasive in Europe in certain aspects. It remains pervasive in Europe in terms of a concern for the value of human life. So in that sense, Christianity remains pervasive. Well, in what sense has belief declined? Well, we see that in aspects such as church attendance, that church attendance has declined. We see that in aspects of identification. People say they don't necessarily identify as Christian. So my wife has COVID too, and she's a few days behind me, so she's still kind of sick at home. And I woke up this morning, and last night too, I went to bed. And I thought I don't have any symptoms left. And I woke up this morning and I thought, nope, my symptoms are all gone from COVID, but my wife is there, and so we've been watching. So I mentioned it on Twitter. Oh shoot, I gotta find it. My wife and I have been enjoying Clarkson's farm. So she first wound up with this grand tour video of driving through Norway and Sweden and Finland, which was hilarious. And then this farm show showed up, and my wife grew up in the Midwest in a farming community. So she's like, oh, and Clarkson's fun to watch. And so we've been watching Clarkson's farm together, and this whole scene about putting a post in the ground. We did much better, myself and Roger and Rick and Jared at Livingstone's, and putting our post in the ground, even though we haven't gotten the security camera on top of it yet. But I digress. And for those of you who are about to leave the comment that, why don't you stick to the point? Fair enough. What was my point about this farm and about... I've distracted myself completely. I've completely gotten off train. Here we go.
But the perhaps the worst realization of all, which was the repeated realization that peoples of faith could not exist together.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So we were talking about, well, what aspect of belief leaves Europe? Well, it's sort of, our analysis is extremely Protestant in many ways, because it's the kind of belief that Protestants forefront. When you join the Christian Reformed Church, you make a profession of faith to the council, and you declare, these are the things I believe. Now, this aspect of faith is something that's quite integral and will continue to be so, I think, in the conversations in this little corner of the internet, because John Vervaeke and, to a degree, Richard Mandrell at the conference were advocating a propositionless type of religion that, and I don't think it's possible, and neither do I think it's advisable. But that's sort of the nuance of the conversation. And so when Murray talks about the loss of faith, it's that aspect of faith that is lost. You go to somebody, why don't you go to church anymore? And I think Vervaeke is exactly right that it's relevance, because you go to the hospital when you're sick, you go to the bank if you need a loan. You understand where and why you go to all of these different institutions, but the why as to the cathedral and the church somehow went missing in terms of the value structure that the civilization has. This seemingly until you really want Westminster Abbey available for the Queen's funeral.
I mean, this is what Europe learns in the 16th century, and it goes awfully deep, that realization. And it takes the repeated realization that peoples of faith could not exist together. I mean, this
Peoples of faith could not exist together. Yes, that's a super important point, because it's not even ancient Antioch had walls within as well as walls without. Why? To keep the different ethne apart. What are the ethne? The nations. Cosmopolitan Roman Empire managed differences in some ways the way polytheism managed gods. Have any that you like? Sort of a libertarian approach. I don't know if it's pluralism per se within Christianity, because the kinds of conflicts he's talking about are within Christianity. Obviously, there was a tremendous struggle going on between Islam and Christianity as well, and between the Christianity of the West and the Christianity of the East. Or if part of what arises, I'm gonna have to think a lot more about this. These are such, see, and this is my going back to what I had with Patterson and Weinstein. You know, don't get too stuck on your favorite hero in this, because we're just sort of dissecting the conversation. You don't have to be for or against any of the people here. We're just dissecting the conversation. And I think Murray's, how can I say it? My interest in this conversation is mostly along the lines of Murray's concerns, because my interest is the continued progress of Christianity in the West. I'll say it that way. And I think Murray has his fingers on a ton of stuff in this. And the point he just made, even though a little bit later they're going to talk about all that the Enlightenment brought to the fore. I think Murray has a tremendous point here that while these Enlightenment, evolutionary, science versus religion things are significantly apart in what has happened to our estimation of belief in the West, the pluralism, even within Christianity, might be even more determinative of the failure of the kinds of Protestant like beliefs and behaviors that we have seen. Now, someone might jump in quickly and say, but Catholics have lost a ton of people too. Just like perhaps people don't go back to their Protestant churches to listen to sermons, people don't go to their Roman Catholic church to receive the sacrament. Okay? And there's sort of the focus of the two traditions.
This is what Europe learns in the 16th century, and it goes awfully deep, that realization, and changes everything.
Part of the striving towards monotheism, let's say, if you think about that psychologically, I would say the striving towards monotheism is...
Now, again, it seems like Peterson isn't engaging this point, but it's always hard to know with Peterson because he comes around the back at things often.
A descriptive enterprise to some degree, because it's an attempt to characterize the nature of the spirit that should be put at the highest place in the hierarchy of perception and action. And then that begs the question is, what should be put in the highest place? And so let me walk through something, and you guys tell me what you think about this. So,
see, and again, this is now, Peugeot just had a tweet that basically said a lot of people have wondered what's with the way you two are sitting. I mean, sometimes they're at different ends of the couch. Sometimes they're together. Or are they a couple who's working things out? Jonathan said, no, we had to share a mic because that's sort of the way this worked. And I can understand that if they're using Zoom or something like that. I mean, it can be a little complex having two mics on one end, and then Rick would say, well, then use vMix, but that's Rick, and Rick is real.
I used to ask my students, why are you writing this essay? And that's
and again, this is one of Peterson's set speeches.
Variation of the question, why do anything? But let's make it concrete. Why are you writing this essay? Well, so that I can get a grade for the class. Why are you taking the class? So that I can finish my year at university. Why are you finishing your year at university and motivated to do that? To get my degree. Why do you want the degree? Well, then it gets fuzzier. Well, maybe I want a job, or maybe I want want to be an educated person, or some amalgam of those. Why do you think it's a good reason to be an educated person or to have a productive career? Well, because I want to be a good person. Well, why do you want to be a good person? Well, because that's part of acting out, and this is where it starts to delve into the mythological, because being a good person makes society work properly and is the best route to, say, life more abundant. And so what does it mean to be a good person? And then it means something like, well, to orient yourself towards the highest good and to speak the truth. And then that's a whole hierarchy of value that is definitely governing, either in an integrated manner or a disintegrated manner, the act.
Okay, so that isn't completely disconnected from what Douglas is saying, because Peterson is making some comments about the, let's say, below the consciousness level motivations that integrate people or divide them.
Actions of the person who's writing the essay. And you might say, well, how hard are you going to try when you write this essay? And the answer to that would be, well, it depends on how well integrated my view of the ethic is all the way up to the highest place. And then we could say, well, the highest place is the divine place, and we could make that a matter of definition. And so then we might say, well, what should be in the divine place? And I would say, well, it has to be something that you can look at the world through, and it has to be something you act out. And then we could say, well, that still leaves residual mystery. And then we might ask, well, how do we characterize it? And I would say we characterize that using fiction, because fiction is the abstraction of hierarchies of attentional prioritization and action. And so we could say that...
And again, I think this is a tremendous point, and it goes to what I was talking about towards the end of the previous commentary on this, that with the dislocation of theology and the promotion of the humanities, it in some ways is a validation of the idea that, generally speaking, we are using fiction and storytelling to orient ourselves in this world, both as individuals and as communities and societies, and to determine how we are going to act and what we are going to value.
In the highest sense, in the biblical corpus, God is the ultimate fictional character. And then we're trying to...
And then Jonathan sort of smiles, because fiction isn't the word that he would use, and me neither.
Characterize his nature as that which should be emulated, that unites us psychologically and socially. And so I'll walk through like 5 representations. So what should be in the highest place? Okay, the spirit that allows you to walk unself-consciously in the garden.
This is sort of another, just like with the first Sam Harris conversation in Vancouver, this is sort of another God number 1 list.
Spirit that calls you to the appropriate dedicated sacrifice. So that's from the Cain and Abel story. The spirit that calls you to batten down the hatches if you're wise when the floods are coming. The spirit that warns you against producing totalitarian spirits of Towers of Babel. The spirit that calls you to, out of your father's tent, that's Abraham, to the adventure of your life. The spirit that calls you out of the tyranny of Egypt, or any tyranny, into the desert and then guides you through the desert. And then I'll skip the rest of the Old Testament for the sake of brevity and jump into the New Testament. because there's a characterization of that which is in the highest place that's revolutionary that emerges out of the Old Testament, but it's the spirit.
See, if I were Douglas Murray at this point, I'd probably be a little frustrated with this, because it's does this, where is the thread of the conversation? And you're going to have to at some point show the connection here. And I don't think this is irrelevant, but he's not sort of come around and made the connection clear.
Spirit that makes you voluntarily willing to bear the entire cross of human suffering and malevolence. And then that character that's at the top of the hierarchy of attention and action, that's characterized as God. You can say, well,
see, and this is sort of a Jordan Peterson argument for the existence of God, relationally, systemically, psychologically.
well, is that a fiction? It's a fiction, but you have to retool your notion of fiction, because fiction then becomes the deepest form of ethical abstraction. And so it's a meta-truth rather than a falsehood. And then if Jonathan's right, and I think he is, and I think John Vervaeke agrees with this, is that if we have to perceive the world with its multiplicity of possibilities through the lens of an ethic, that ethic becomes the defining tool that we use, in fact, to extract even factual information out of the infinite array of information that presents itself to us.
Peugeot would definitely agree with that. I don't know if John would agree with that.
So not only is science nested inside a fiction, in some sense, the fiction is more deeply true than the science, and it's so deeply true that without the fiction, you don't even have the precondition for science.
And again, I think that's basically presuppositionalism, but it's not tremendously directly addressing Douglas's question. And so I paused the video here, and he's looking like,
Although, is it still a fiction? Is it still a fiction, Jordan? Because for you, this is...
and then now we're gonna think about that word, because basically the definition of, in the bookstore, fiction versus nonfiction is this question of truth, and the way sort of a correspondence theory of truth, representational theory of truth, exactly what sense of truth do we mean?
You're stuck in the Schopenhauerian.
Look, Jonathan and I were talking about this last night, because we just sat and did this long seminar on Exodus. And you might ask, well, did the events in Exodus really happen? And our conclusion was...
And again, when we say really happen, everybody's mind shifts down to fundamentally a materialist ontology. Was there material correspondence with the description in the book? All right. And that then is a tell of our ontological presuppositions with respect to the level that is most real. And while Jordan is sort of with his a truer fiction than science, which is what he's argued with for the last few minutes, it's deeply difficult for a lot of people to go there, because for them, their ontological assumptions are materialist foundation, emergent everything else.
Well, not only did they happened in a meta manner, they're still happening. They happened with such reality.
And you can see when Jordan argues this, he is sort of feeling his way to a new ontology and the language that surrounds it.
That they haven't stopped happening. And what does that mean? Well, everyone still struggles with the spirit of tyranny. And everyone still struggles with the fact that when you escape from a tyranny, you don't hit the promised land, you hit the desert. And then when you're in the desert of your imagination or with your lost peers, then you need to struggle with what guides you and what should guide you when you're lost. And then you have to grapple with the problem of appropriate and reliable forms of governance, because that's all part of the Exodus story. And so it didn't happen the way a happening would occur if you just detailed it out as a camera holding empirical observer. It happened in a way deeper way that just doesn't stop happening.
So I think that for me, like for sure, the fiction thing is a difficulty for me, that category. But I can follow the process and understand this idea, let's say, of this abstracted story that moves up. But then
and part of what's at play here is how do we evaluate abstraction? We certainly greatly value abstraction in terms of mathematics and physics. If the bridge works on paper, we will dedicate millions and millions of dollars to make it a reality. So we do value abstraction significantly. And I like the point that Peterson made that the kind of truth that is represented in the book of Exodus is not only, and I think theologians have really struggled this in modern theology, or maybe I should say modernist theology, even though that those assumptions and practices have remained present in the church and in Christian individual reading, religious and pietistic reading of the text ever since. Okay, I'll say it that way. That the patterns in the desert, and therefore really any sense of law or norm, has built in within it that sense that there's a truth to this that isn't just a correspondence between a man named Moses in a book and a man named Moses in a wilderness and a people somehow connected with Israel and Jacob in a book, in a story, and a people who are living in a desert as shepherds, yada, yada, yada. I mean, we always bump into this in terms of the question of, let's say, historical Adam and those debates. But Jordan is pointing out that a big part of the story is that built into the story are patterns that are perennial. They keep coming around and they don't go away.
I think is that it's causal, that what we're actually discovering a pattern which is causal to the rest. And so that it's not just that it's a fiction, it's actually that which gives...
Because by a fiction, we mean, or do we mean, oh, this is a nice story made up that is supposed to be sort of ornamental. But again, as I talked about last time, if you look at the work of George Marsden, and when he writes about the universities, how in public universities, the humanities, history, English, replaces theology and biblical studies. And what we're doing, let's say, when we study history, is that we are looking for patterns that have happened before. That, again, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes, but it does rhyme. We are looking for patterns, and we're sort of using an audible musical resonance there. There are patterns that will continue. And so you'll often hear this when people say lessons of history. It's assumed that there are patterns that have happened in the past, and then patterns are going to happen before. And so in that sense, even in a world which wants to say that life is just chaos, we're betraying that when we read history. At least to the degree if we read history.
It makes it possible for the world to exist. And so the word fiction at this point becomes ridiculous. It's not a fiction, it's actually the source of reality. And so that's God, right? It's the source of the possibility for reality to exist. And the manner in which, let's say, that happens is not just a description of mechanical causes. It has to do with this orientation towards the good, this ethic which comes down and makes it even possible for us to perceive the world. And so I think that for me, for sure, it's not a fiction. I think that the events in Scripture happened, but they don't have to be described in a way that is equivalent to our scientific understanding, because they're trying to...
See, now this gets interesting, because we've already noted that, okay, so what if a historian were to write the events of the book of Exodus? Well, on one hand, in many ways, our Western notion of history has been formed by the Bible. Because, well, Herodotus is the first historian, he's the first Greek historian. Someone may very well argue that the Hebrew scribes were historians in a way that a truly modern, and especially a postmodern, could never be. Because what happens with the modernist historian is that the implied rhyming or repetition or enduring perennial effect of patterns remains, is smuggled into the reading and the practice, even in an atomistic modernistic sense, even while in an atomistic modernistic sense it is denied. But that's why we love history. So Peugeot's
to account for more than our scientific understanding.
Just like, well, the reason I would throw a word in here for fiction, I mean, we would have to retool our understanding of what fiction is.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the problem. But when I read something like a novel by Dostoevsky, I think, well, is this true? And the answer is, well, those precise events never happened. So on that basis, it's not true. But then there's something wrong with that description, because the characterizations in Dostoevsky are so true that in some sense they've never been surpassed. And so, and I do think, to elaborate on Jonathan's point, is that imagine that human beings, like any other object, have a being and then a realm of possible becoming. And I would say our attempts to characterize the spirit at the top of the attentional hierarchy is an attempt to flesh out and to discover the realm of human possibility. And so it does bring it into being to some degree, even though it's implicate in the order. And that would be the logos of the world, right? It's like, what's the Bible about? Well, it's about people, clearly. And so everything that's detailed out in those stories is about the nature of humanity. Now, how that's related to the nature of the divine is something we're trying to puzzle out. But it's clearly about people. And is it true? Well, it has this weird sense of being true that we just described, which
But there's also a reality, which is that in a world that understands this or lives in this way, then the manner that they will perceive, remember, and tell stories will be different from the way that you tell a policeman the type of proofs that you saw. And so what we're asking of Scripture is not only not the right questions, we're not understanding what type of descriptions that they are. And so I do believe that the stories in Scripture happen, but I don't believe that the people who recorded them had to do it in a way that accounts for our forensic nature, let's say, the way that we think that something happened in the world in terms of a scientist would describe phenomena. I think that they're doing it in a manner to show this very pattern in the story of what it is that was happening in the world.
I don't know that it's that far off. The answer Jonathan just gave there is I think very close to the kinds of answers I was given to these questions at Calvin Seminary in the 80s. I don't think it's very far from the Report 44, I think from 1973 or 5 in the mid-70s in the Christian Form, Nature and Authority of Scripture, talked about event character. I've mentioned that before, in that we can't expect ancient writers to have the same kinds of assumptions that we have today, yet. As I mentioned before, I'm reading this really fascinating book on China and the Second World War, Forgotten Ally. Why do we read that? Well, we're curious, yeah. But why should I care what happened in China in the 1930s? Well, there's communism and there's fascism and there's nationalism and it's China, and something deep within me looks at that story and assumes that there are patterns in that story that can relate to the world I am living in now, and I can gain wisdom from that story. And I think those same things were in the minds of the Hebrew scribes with the writing of the book of Exodus. That is enduring, and that, I think, for us is a deep reality in this conversation.
Yes, I'm wary about some of this because we need to get down to brass tacks, as it were. And Jonathan has done one, but Jordan, you said you talked about it again as a story, and as you say, I mean, Dostoevsky. Obviously, if you say is Dostoevsky true, you need to say in what sense. But then, I mean, the issue with the Bible, the issue with Christianity.
Now at this point, Murray has basically decided that Jordan and Jonathan are sort of on the same page. I'm going to join in their conversation, and we'll kind of abandon the thread that I had developed back there.
The issue with faith is that it's obviously different. It must be in a different realm. It's clearly in a different realm because it claims different things for itself. Dostoevsky doesn't demand that we believe that Raskolnikov lived. The Bible, if you're going to be a believer, you have to be able to say, in the words of the Creed, that you believe in the virgin birth, that you believe, most importantly, in the resurrection. And as you well know, Jordan, many of us can walk 99% of the way there in terms of belief in the truth of the story. Or as Betjeman puts it, but is it true? Is it true? And then stumble on the last thing.
Yeah, well.
Now, Esther, of course, has been big in this on Twitter, and I guess the Randos United channel are going to have their own commentary on this, which I'm really looking forward to. But she pointed out an article to me that Douglas Murray had written that she's pointed out to me before. I'll just pull it up. Murray mentions Richard Holloway earlier in the conversation, and this is the talk about Richard Holloway, and it comes into, okay, well, I'll read a little bit. Did you ever think he was preaching lies? No, I never preached lies. I never pretended to things I wasn't feeling. I'm tempted to make a smaller side video on this, on sort of modernism, romanticism, and what seems to be emerging after it. And I don't mean simply skeptical post-modernity or postmodernism in that sense. It wasn't about getting people to inhale certain historical facts. It was about something liberating them into a kind of redemptive, caring, compassionate way of living. But is it true? I asked him. Does he think that the Christian story is true? There is a considered pause. It's true in the sense that any myth is true, that Ovid's metamorphoses are true. But of course, when Lewis and Tolkien are talking about a true myth, they don't mean like Ovid's metamorphoses. They mean something a little bit deeper and richer. And this, of course, is sort of the battleground that they're fighting over. And many have said in the comment section or on Twitter in response to my video, yeah, sort of the line between those who want to say that Christianity is mythically true, perhaps in Brett Weinstein's speech, metaphorically true, but not. See, I think literally is just a terrible word for that, because you should probably say it's literarily true. Well, what do you mean? Do you mean physically true? Well, what do you mean by that? And then you begin to have conversations about, did Jesus and Peter walk on water? Is the tomb empty? These kinds of things. And you have this class of people for whom whether or not the tomb is empty, it doesn't matter, because this is a story about new beginnings and happy endings and second chances and Easter as the renewal of the earth, etc., etc. Mythologically true versus a degree in which there's a physicality that is moving through history, and there is a crunchy ontological God that is doing stuff that even a scientist would have to stop and say, yeah, Tammy doesn't have cancer anymore.
Okay, so one of the things you pointed out in your conversation with Dave Rubin was that the religious substrate risks devolving into something like a puerile social justice without its rooting in something like transcendent mystery.
Or if it's not rooted in...
So let's just leave that as a proposition for a moment, and then I want to return to the issue of the resurrection. So I'll push that as far as I've been able to push it. And so it definitely appears...
I don't know. Jordan said he needed at least 3 years. It's been 3 years, but he was sick, so I guess we'd have to give him another 1.5 years in between.
To me that the story of the Passion is an archetypal and foretold tragic catastrophe. And I'll explain the foretold
Tolkien's eucatastrophe. You can throw that in there.
part later. So it's an archetypal catastrophe because it melds all the worst things that could happen to a person in their life.
And this is sort of a fun list.
And so it's death, but it's knowledge of certain death associated with death, and then it's youthful death, and then it's youthful death at the hands of the mob, and it's youthful death at the hands of the mob despite innocence, despite the mob knowing of innocence, and then it's contaminated.
And in front of the mother.
In front of the mother, yes, and as a consequence of the relativistic nihilism of the Romans and the tyranny and the choice of the crowd, and so and the betrayal of a best friend, all of that. And so it is definitely a journey through all the worst things you could confront in your life. But then that's not enough, because there's the mythological cloud, let's say, around the narrative, because dying horribly and unjustly isn't enough. You also have to go to hell and harrow it. And so that would mean that the ultimate extension of the human experience is not only the confrontation with malevolence and unjust death of the innocent, but a genuine journey into hell. Okay, then the question would be, and this is the sticker as far as I'm concerned, isn't it the case that in your own life, Douglas, that the more deeply that you've peered into the abyss of things, the more likely it is that a light shines through it? And this is sort of the ultimate question of the resurrection, is like, how do you revivify your faith in life? And the answer might really be, by the
So he's focusing on the mythological truth.
radical acceptance of the malevolent tragedy of life, but even more than that, by the radical embracing of even the hellish aspect of life. And that if you did that radically enough, well, who knows what would happen? I mean, we know clinically, if you find what people are avoiding and are afraid of and are disgusted by that's blocking their pathway forward, and you get them to confront that voluntarily, they get courageous and better. It's clearly the case, and it looks to me like
So it's true that mythological courage certainly has value in physical world outcomes.
The Passion representation and its mythological substrate is exposure therapy on a cosmic level. And you know that the more deeply you grapple with the fundamental issues of life, the wiser and broader you get. And then I guess I would ask, if everyone did that to the utmost, what would it be that we might be able to conquer? And I don't know the answer to that. Life would radically transform. I mean,
this is in many ways another version of his answer to the resurrection. We don't know the limits. That's what he said in videos going all the way back to 2017 when asked about the resurrection. We don't know the limits. And so this is another version of that answer.
I see what happens, because people write me all the time. I see what happens when people adopt a certain amount of responsibility for their life. I mean, they write and they say, man, everything's way better. And it's like, okay, how much better could it be? And this is also associated with this idea in the New Testament. There's a section, I believe it's in the Sermon on the Mount, where Christ says, it might not be, but he says that heaven will not emerge and all things will not manifest themselves till everyone brings everything inside them out, right? Their divine possibility, let's say. And
He's got some very interesting reads, always has, on biblical verses. So I'd love to, I think I know what verse he's talking about, but it's certainly not handled in a way I've seen my colleagues handle it.
And that part of the reason that the world is fallen the way it is because we hold back our best. And we don't abide by the law and the prophetic spirit. And we don't bring everything that's within us out into the world. And the world is lesser as a consequence of that. And I do believe that we don't bring our best out because we're afraid and because we're desperate and because we don't have the courage to confront the malevolence and suffering and the hellish aspect of life. And so I do think, so you look at the death and you say, well, is the death more real and the hell more real, or is the resurrection more real? And obviously, in some sense, I'm speaking symbolically. But it seems to me, it's the same idea, that it's an ancient mythological idea that you could go into the belly of the beast and rescue your father. And you're trying to do that with your book, The War in the West, right? It's like you see the assault on these values and you're attempting to resurrect those values. I see that as the same pattern.
Yeah, but I think, Douglas, I understand your question. Like, I understand your question. The answer is the grave empty? Something like that. Like, was the grave empty? And this is, I think, where maybe it's the...
Okay, now, Peterson just basically gave a long answer about the mythological, and Jonathan turns here to the physical.
Most difficult for many materialists to understand. And I know that my ramblings about the glass and about the good and about this might seem like it's going all over the place. But it's actually supremely important to understand that if you change your perception about the manner in which the world exists, focused based on the idea of a good, of an ethic, that it's what underlies even the factuality of the world, then that which will convince me of the truth of the resurrection is not about a bunch of material facts. It's about the imposition of that story as being so real that it overwhelms everything else.
Okay, now what he just said there was really critical and shows how much Peugeot is not a modernist. Because what he's saying is that for many people, the approach to belief in the resurrection is something like a minimal facts argument. It's something like a forensic examination, and you can find all sorts of treatment like this in modernist apologetics. Lee Strobel, The Case for Christ, the minimal facts argument, Habermas, and there's lots of those arguments, and part of my critique of the modernist approach is this, that even if someone on the basis of the evidence then says, okay, I believe in the resurrection, that then falls into C.S. Lewis's point in his book Miracles, where Lewis says, most of the time when people talk about whether or not the resurrection happened, they talk about what happened in the first minutes or moments on Easter Sunday morning at the tomb of Christ. The New Testament doesn't talk that way. Does that mean that the New Testament embraces the mythological truth of the resurrection and says that the physical truth of the resurrection is unimportant? Lewis says no. I say no. Peugeot says no. I think the Christian church has always said no. Because it's all the layers that matter. And the more real something is, the more real it is on all the layers. And even in a modernist frame, if someone, after looking at a minimal facts argument or looking at all of these other modernist apologetic arguments, says, okay, I believe he rose from the dead, then that opens up something that I've had many people over the years say to me is, so what if he walked out of the grave? What does that have to do with my life? Well, now it begins to connect with this idea of the mythological truth and the idea of what we talked about in terms of history and ongoing patterns. Because very much the New Testament seems to say, you can find it in the book of Romans, with Romans chapter 6 on baptism and the resurrection from the Apostle Paul. If you live with me, you will die like me, and you will be raised like me. That is the promise. The general resurrection of the dead. Our participation in the general resurrection of the dead. The life that we expect in continuation and through that general revelation in whatever the new world and the new dispensation has to come. I've seen that people just having a modernistic, physicalist idea of the resurrection is insufficient. And this gets into Lewis's, the latter part of the book of Lewis's Miracles, where he talks about miracles of the old creation and miracles of the new creation, that this resurrection is not only a physical event, it's not only a mythological truth, but it is something that has an enduring pattern in the world today and is by no means exhausted, because it will culminate in a general physical resurrection of the dead. That is the Christian assertion. And now I completely understand that even making an assertion like that in these words is, even though that is challenging, because people are like, well, I can't even conceptualize it. Well, good. That shows that you're thinking. It's very difficult to conceptualize. What on earth would that look like in detail? We have very little idea. But this is the legacy, and that then shapes a life. And it's that ongoing life that Lewis points to in his book Miracles, and points to in terms of a transformation, and points to in terms of the transformation of a world that has been happening for 2,000 years, and transformations of ourselves as individuals, and transformation of a community, and all of those ways in which that event reshapes patterns going forward.
And it shines a light on everything else. Through the image of the resurrection, we're able to see everything through it. And so if you ask me, like, what is the mechanical cause of the resurrection? Like, how is it that this body could have, I would say that is obfuscated not only in the text, but also in the creed. The reason why in the creed it says he rose again according to the scriptures is because nobody wanted to try to give you a mechanical description. And in the text itself, when the disciples encounter Christ, they don't even recognize him. What is going on there? They don't even know who he is.
Well, in the beginning at Emmaus, yes.
Yeah, so there's a desire in the text to obfuscate the mechanical causes of the resurrection. And that is not the way. So if you try to get at it that way, you're never going to get.
I don't know if I'd say there's a desire in the text to obfuscate. I prefer N.T. Wright's description of it, which is that the resurrection texts are unembroidered. I think that's the better way to look at it. They're just, these are the witnesses. These are the accounts. We treat them as sacred and holy in a way by not sort of embroidering them with, well, they later on obviously get embroidered, and they get re-embroidered by preachers every Easter.
Get there, obviously. But I don't get there that way because I see through the world through the resurrection. And it makes so much more sense. And that's maybe C.S. Lewis's argument, is to say...
That is Lewis's argument, both in terms of the Son, that I see the world by it. I don't know if that's what Jonathan Peugeot is thinking of, or if he's referencing his argument in the book Miracles, because that's, in many ways, what Lewis says in his book Miracles.
It's like, give me that one. We need one miracle. Everybody needs one miracle to then lay the world out from that miracle, whether it's the Big Bang, whether it's whatever it is, you need that first miracle. So give me the resurrection and I'll explain the entirety of human experience through that one miracle. So that is what convinces me of the resurrection. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
So I was thinking about this idea too. I'm sure Jonathan will have some criticisms of this idea, but we'll see. So there's this idea in Christianity that See,
now, it seems like Jordan and Jonathan are sharing ear pods here, and they've each got one. And so probably what they couldn't do was make the 2 sets of ear pods, I believe, at the beginning of the vehicle they're both wearing. Maybe I'm wrong. I'd have to go back and look, and I don't feel like going back and losing my place.
The voluntary sacrifice of Christ redeemed the world. And so then you might ask, well, and that's already happened in some fundamental sense. But the stories that put that proposition forward play with the idea of time in an extreme way, because you have the notion, for example, of God being the Alpha and the Omega and being outside of time. And so the manner in which time is being used in the stories is very mysterious. But then I would say, well, it seems to me that it's something like this, is that a sufficiently courageous confrontation with the catastrophe of life would redeem it to an indeterminate degree. And that's already happened because we have the example. But even though it's already happened, we still have to do it. It's something like that. And you know, there's this emphasis in the biblical writings in particular that each person has a divine part to play, and that in some sense, the part that each person plays is equally necessary and equally valuable. And so we have the pattern, which is to confront things in as forthright a manner as we possibly can and to bear the maximal degree of responsibility, and that will redeem things, but we still have a real destiny. Like, we each have something real to do that's been granted to us, or that hasn't been taken away from us or lifted away from us. And we could turn the world into hell if we wanted to, but we could maybe do the alternative in some real sense.
I don't disagree with that. What Jonathan says about the resurrection and reality, of course, raises a particular conundrum, which is that if you're going to use religion as an explanation of reality, you're also describing the event that subverts reality completely. That the resurrection is the thing that is the least possible thing to do given the world as we understand it.
Least possible than the Big Bang, for example. I don't know. Like, I see all scientists move towards something which is least possible, let's say.
As a precondition.
Yeah, of course. That's something that is impossible as a precondition for possibility.
What I'm trying to get to is a sort of, not diminish it, but having your cake and eating it thing, which is religion explaining reality, reality explained by religion, and also this thing happens that has never been able to happen, and that if you can make that leap, then you've got the faith in religion. I'm not saying that this isn't possible to do. You obviously do it yourself, but it's two things that seem to be in some very, very deep way contradictory. And maybe the contradiction is the point.
Well, I think you also do it imperfectly, you know? I mean, you ask yourself, I mean, you're in some ways on the edges of the cultural battlefront. You know, you ask yourself, well, how much of the catastrophe of the world can you voluntarily take on? There's many, many problems that beset us, and there's a great adventure in trying to rectify them. And it's an open question how much better you can get at that if you proceed in the spirit of goodwill. I think that's an indication in the most fundamental sense of your belief. You know, because we don't want to reduce this to a proposition again, because I don't think that's the right, I think it's an axiom of faith. It's something like, okay, do I believe in the resurrection? It's like, well, it's not a scientific proposition. At least I'm not going to treat it.
And it's as I said before, you can find lots of people who say they believe in the resurrection and then they don't live like they believe in the resurrection. I'll say it that way. And so we've tended to treat it in a way that distracts people from the longer point that Peugeot was making about how the resurrection should function in our lives.
It that way at the moment. It's a manner of confronting reality. And so then it would be a statement of faith, which is that I believe that if I act oriented towards love and life more abundant, and if I speak the truth, then I can prevail against the gates of hell. and I'm willing to put my life on the
Now, and this is where Peterson's, he has an element of faith, but notice how alone he is in faith. And whereas I think as a Christian, I might say I can prevail against the gates of hell by Christ. And there's a danger of idolatry and instrumentalism that can easily come in and comes in often.
line, then I can prevail against the gates of hell. And I'm willing to put my life on the line to see if that's true. And I would say,
and that is faith. I'm willing to put my life on the line, maybe not to see that that's true, because that sort of turns it into a test, but because I trust in Jesus more than I trust myself.
say that's the faith, right? Because who knows? But what's the alternative? It's like, are we going to accept the ultimate, what would you say, the ultimate metaphysical reality of the pointlessness of being and the atrociousness of hellish suffering? I mean, it looks to me like we can rectify.
Now Jordan's getting down to his religious system right here. This is what I think, where he really asserts this is his religion.
That. And it also looks like we have to move towards that rectification in something like faith, right?
Okay, but well, let me return to the two questions I posed earlier on about this, where the thing that the religious have a problem with and the thing that the non-religious have a problem with. Putting my cards on the table, I would be relatively happy for Jonathan's view to be dominant in my society, and for me never to be asked whether I literally believe in the resurrection. To dodge the question. I'd be relatively happy for that to be the situation. Because
he wants to be a skeptic in a thoroughly, in a deep Christendom.
There is the place where we get into an awful lot of problems. But that there is virtue and good in what he's describing. We could leave it as a mystery unless our age happened to be leaning on this because it needed to know whether the story was literally true, more than Dostoevsky, more than the great poetry, that it was the thing that we relied on more than anything.
Frederick Buechner has a terrific story in one of his books where, everybody's running around. I don't believe that there is a God. And then suddenly, one night, the stars miraculously begin to move in the sky, and they spell out, "I exist, God." And Buechner says, right away, churches are full, everybody's praising God, yada, yada, yada. Within 3 to 6 months, everything goes back to normal. Same thing happens with people. Well, I believe in the resurrection. Okay, so what? Where does it go? What does it do? It's sort of the Book of James question.
You would need to know that in that situation.
So I think that for sure Christians believe that the resurrection happened, that it's an event, that it's something that is not just a fiction in the simplest sense. But they also do insist that you can't describe it in terms of mechanical causes, that it cannot be reduced to that. And so when people always ask me, like, did Jesus sit up in the grave? And I'm like, that's not what the text says. If you read what it says in Scripture, it leaves it very mysterious at what the event is. I think for the reason that it is in some way a meta event. It's an event which is, even in Scripture, there's even this description that talks about Christ as being the lamb that was sacrificed before the foundation of the world. That is the notion that the sacrifice, that the death and the resurrection of Christ is in some ways the foundation of reality. So, and it's not, I know it's hard because people are such scientists and such materialists that they struggle, but that's why I try to help people understand this, the fact that attention precedes phenomena. Mm-hmm. And that's why sacrifice comes before phenomena. The importance of sacrificing the externals, of being able to perceive and give up the unity of something. That is actually the foundation of reality. And so it's ritualized in cultures as actual physical sacrifice, that's fine. But then it leads up to the mystery of Christ, which is that ultimately the highest version of that.
Poor Jordan's pregnant with an idea. Come on, Jonathan, let me talk.
That is self-sacrifice. And if you do that and you participate in that, you are gaining a key to the mystery of how reality actually lays itself out.
Let's look at, I've always been struck by Michelangelo's Pieta. And so, because it's a sacrificial offering. And so we could say, well, what's the precondition for the life of a autonomous child? And the precondition is that the mother is willing to offer up the child as a sacrificial entity in the face of life. And the psychoanalysts used to describe the necessary failure of the mother. So that's the anti-Oedipal mother. The Oedipal mother protects and shelters, right, and then destroys because of that. Whereas the non-Oedipal mother lets go so the child can be hurt and broken and killed by the world. And so then you might say, well, the willingness to sacrifice the innocent to the realities of existence is a precondition for existence. And I actually think that's true. And so Jonathan's notion that the sacrifice of the innocent lamb is a precondition for existence, you could say at least that that's true phenomenologically. Or maybe for the existence that isn't hell, because that's another way of thinking about it.
Let me just pick up on this point again, because we might be returning to this what I described as these two problems we've got to address. The first is whether it's possible to accept the idea of religion being true in some sense and essentially philosophy for the masses, which is how many 19th century thinkers were already thinking about it.
So I looked up Schopenhauer's dialogue on religion, and with the wonder of the internet, here it is. And it's, I haven't read the whole thing yet, but when you start reading it, it's exactly Douglas Murray's point.
That you can say it's true in some sense, and it's the best way to allow the largest number of people to contend with the deepest set of ideas.
Now, when you said it that way, of course, there's a certain thing that wells up inside of us that says, "Oh, but I am the seeing man who looks on all of the blind men groping the elephant."
Because philosophy is only ever going to be an elite sport, and in no derogatory term of the meaning elite, but only a small number of people are going to engage in it. Most people are not going to engage in it. Therefore, religion is the best means to engage with meaning in the world. That's one way of seeing things to begin with. But the second, and that's something we could contend with. But the second thing I wanted to say is just to give Jonathan a breather, as it were, on some of my demands, which is what about the non-religious in this? And the non-religious problem in all of this, it comes back to what you described earlier, Jordan, as the patterns problem. The patterns we see in the universe, including patterns of truth. What does the non-believer do when they find, for instance, the beauty of a mathematical formula which works and is there and is true? What does it mean? What does it mean when we find the extraordinary patterns in nature? What does it mean when we find patterns in our own lives?
Because we tend to see that patterns and productive, fruitful relationships are often indicative of, this is the cosmological argument, indicative of intelligence, of design, and of care. And in some ways this goes back to the Peterson-Dawkins conversation about, well, what if there's something happening in terms of sexual selection that right away at the start they are opting for the good.
And what you describe as things like that thing that people can recognize, of needing to see through the void and see the glimpse of light. What do we do about the sense, for instance, that we know that we're contending with a very, very difficult problem in our lives, so many difficult problems in our lives, one of which, perhaps the deepest of which is, does this matter? Does this matter beyond itself? Or one of my favorite quotes from Rilke. Rilke says in one of the Duino elegies, does the outer space into which we dissolve taste of us at all? Does the outer space into which we dissolve taste of us at all? Now, our senses, probably one of our deepest hopes is that the...
There's an Imago Dei image.
answer is, does the outer space into which we dissolve taste of us at all? Now, our senses, probably one of our deepest hopes is that the answer is yes. Yes. That what we do in our lives does not just matter to us or just to the people around us, although that's not nothing, but matters in some far higher sense. And then we get to that question underneath that, which is, are we simply meaning-seeking beings, or is there meaning? And the problem with this question is it leans us towards the second one. Our deepest hope is that the second one is true.
Okay, so when I look at that, I start by...
And now, I mentioned in previous videos that when you look at someone like, say, Richard Dawkins, or I think degree, same with John Vervaeke, why, Richard Dawkins, atheist, John Vervaeke, non-theist. That's a significant difference. But the question between, let's say, a full-fledged theist, God number one and God number two, God is both God number one and God number two. God is both agent and arena, which means God is capable of relationality, care. God is conscious. That comes up in my dialogos with John Vervaeke in Thunder Bay. Something happens after deism in the modern realm where people looking at the universe say, there is not a caring God. Or if there had been a caring God, there would be less suffering in the universe. Now, again, I think Alvin Plantinga adequately wrestles with that question in the abstract theoretically, and I don't think it's necessarily a difficult question to address. But then Alvin Plantinga and many others turn around and say, but pastorally, because of, in a sense, perhaps the imago Dei that is within us, that we are a part of, that's a far harder thing to answer. And the fact that there are so many different takes on that question, on one hand, can undercut the idea that any of us can answer it definitively with respect to the entire universe, just by virtue of the extremely limited sample size of experience that any one of us has the opportunity to prevail themselves of. Yet that intuition, back to Douglas's Murray quotation of poetry, I should just go back to it because
philosophy is only ever going to have meaning in the world. But some of my demands back towards of truth, matters, and patterns in our problem in our life. Does this matter? Does this matter beyond itself? Or one of my favorite quotes from Rilke. Rilke says in one of the Duino elegies, does the outer space into which we dissolve taste of us at all?
Does the outer space in which we dissolve taste of us at all? What a poignant way to get there.
That's not actually how people act. When push comes to shove, people act like there's nothing more real than pain. Mm-hmm. And you can't argue yourself out of pain, or you can do that with great difficulty. And
but Peterson has answered this. Can't find that clip. I hate it when that happens.
We could start with the reality of suffering. And then I would say that that's a phenomenological description or an existential description of reality. But I'm okay with that because I'm not going to make the assumption that reality is fundamentally material and devoid of purpose. It might be, but it might not be, because we're trying to figure out what's fundamental. Okay, we act as if pain is real. We act as if the pain of infants is particularly real. Okay, then you might say, well, is there anything more real than pain? And I would say, yeah, there is. The meaning that overcomes pain is more real than the pain. And then I would say, well, that's actually what meaning is. And I can speak psychologically about this. It's like, we know the quality of a meaningful experience. It's engaging, it's engrossing, it activates positive emotion and enthusiasm, it makes people more creative, it quells anxiety, and it's an analgesic, probably mediated by opiate mechanisms. And then the phenomena of meaning seems to emerge on the axis between chaos and order. And so let's say that we fall into a deeply meaningful conversation like the one we're having now. And the reason it's meaningful is because our nervous systems are signaling to us that we're inhabiting a structure that we comprehend and that's secure, and that we understand what's going on. So we're not anxious and upset, but we're moving new information into that structure at an optimized rate. And our nervous system signals to us that that's deeply meaningful, and that regulates our positive emotion and quells our negative emotion. But I think all of that's occurring in relationship to this entire hierarchy of attentional priority that we described. And so the more deeply meaningful something is, the more it's associated with every level in that hierarchy, all the way up to the level of divinity itself. And then it's a matter of faith. It's like, well, is that a reflection of fundamental reality? And the answer might be, it might be.
We also don't have access to any other reality. Like, it's actually the other reality that doesn't participate in this hierarchy of attention, this hierarchy of goods, which is, it's like I would say a delusion, but it's at least something that you're positing without much proof that it exists. The idea that the world out there completely exists neutrally without a value hierarchy which sustains it into unities is something which I think is more dubious than the other way around. Mm-hmm. And so that you could
I think the scientific evidence supports that proposition now.
You could take your idea of pain and meaning, and you could reduce it to the most simple experience of the world, which is question, answer. What is pain? And that is the meaning. And that happens all the time. Like you encounter a phenomena that you've never seen before. And that phenomena is screaming at you, like, am I dangerous? What am I? What is this? And then there's their manner in which we're able to bring it together and to give it a name and to identify it. And that's already meaning. Their identification of things, especially if we understand that it necessitates a hierarchy of attention, is always meaning. It's actually harder to live without meaning. You can't move without meaning.
Right.
Like you
right.
can't
point your eyes without.
You would just lay in bed and wait to die without meaning. Like nothing would exist nothing would have light in it.
I completely agree. I mean, I think it's one of perhaps the biggest questions of our age of where you can find that, as it always has been. It's just that the options in the buffet at the moment are all demanding of something which a lot of people in our society, at the very least, find it hard to accept. What you've just described about, the nature of sacrifice, for instance, and all these things, we know from Girard and others. I mean, these are at such a deep level that they certainly come before religion. They certainly come before any of the religions that we currently have in the world today still
Defining religion the way secular society identifies religion.
operating. I mean, what's the oldest religion we have in the world? Judaism, that's still actively a religion that's 3,500 years old or whatever is young compared to the instincts we're talking about, such as the need for a scapegoat, the need for sacrifice. I mean, we go back thousands of years and we keep finding some kind of organized belief system which believed in sacrifice, and totally futile sacrifice in the cases of most of these ideas. But
I'm going to pause here. I'm tired. Still don't have the stamina I necessarily had before. So I'm going to pause it here. And there's about a third of it left. I've done 2/3 of it, and we'll see if I pick it up. We'll see how my day tomorrow goes. So thank you for your time and attention.